You can take drawing and you can break it down into its component elements: line, mark, shape, form, texture, volume, perspective.
I'm very privileged to be talking today to Sarah Simblet, who is a very well-known artist, an anatomist, and who teaches at the Ruskin School of Fine Art at Oxford University, as well as at the Royal College of Art. The context of this discussion is the up-and-coming Kirstenbosch Biennale this year in 2013. And I thought it would be wonderful to be able to interview Sarah with the aim of assisting artists and giving them access to her very fine mind and knowledge. How would you distinguish between botanical art and scientific illustration?
My perception, coming from a fine art perspective, so outside of the field, I can see there's a very subtle gradation with some distinctly different things and an awful lot of grey area between them. So on the one hand, there's the scientific language of a very clean line drawing with stipple marks, which is scientific illustration. It's an international language, and it's interesting to me as coming from a fine art background that it's actually removing the individuality of the person who made it. They're actually expressing a very fine skill in being able to do that. And of course you can see differences in skill, but it is quite a scientific language. And then you have botanical illustration, which may be painted and in colour, and in the same way sometimes you can really read the graphic mark of an individual artist, and then other times it's quite interesting when there's a set of drawings to put together. At a glance I think the same person's made them, and then when I read underneath they were made by 3 or 4 different botanical artists, I'm quite astonished. And there is, of course, perhaps a greater personal sensitivity that comes into those particular drawings, worked up in colour. They're paintings usually, but nevertheless there can be still a style of working that you can just recognise very clearly. And then, which I would see as still being a sort of scientific illustration that is not necessarily the personal expression of the artist, but is an individual's ability to render something in a way that is uniform to a particular style, that is then accepted as a document that can stand in place of that particular plant in its absence. So they must be immaculately correct and define the difference between that species and its very closest relative, and that must be clearly visible. And then I think beyond that, then you start to get into maybe botanical art, where there is a freedom of expression. But again, it comes back to the purpose of the image. Yes. What's the image for? And is it for reproduction? If it's for reproduction, in what publication and what's the budget? And it's likely, if it's a scientific journal, it's more likely to be the black and white line with stipple. If it is a beautiful monograph, it may be more likely that it's going to be the coloured work. And then in your exhibitions, I think there's also a greater variety. But the more the individual is seen in the image in terms of their personal way of experiencing and expressing that plant and saying something about it, then you're getting further away from scientific illustration into botanical art, I think.
Many artists complain that their work has this flat look. How would you suggest they overcome that?
I think that the problem with the flat look is that they're very often rendering an entire surface with immaculate detail all over, which doesn't simulate our experience of seeing. As we're talking to one another, I'm using my right eye to look at your right eye. My left eye is out of focus, and so is yours, and the rest of you is out of focus. And so long as I hold your eye, that's crisply in focus. Everything around you is becoming more abstract. And then out here, all I perceive is movement, which is how your eye works. So then it means that if you look at a lot of fine art drawings, Rembrandt or Goya are great examples, then you'll see that there are areas of absolute focus within the image, that something is very precisely and clearly defined, usually with very small, delicate marks, small marks. And then there'll be other areas that could be very, very loosely brushed in, that and we know precisely what they are because your brain is so keen to identify everything that it sees. That's why if we look at clouds or fire, we can see figures in clouds. We see things in fire because there is that innate survival need to be able to identify everything instantly. So it means that your viewer is very, very keen to say exactly what it is with hardly any information at all. So if you, as an artist, were to make an image where you provide just enough information to conjure that person's experience of the known subject, then they will read it, they'll see it. They don't need all the rest of it. And therefore, also if you have areas of precise focus and then areas that are slightly more abstract, then it means that you're going to emulate vision, you emulate our experience of seeing, which is why you'd often describe those sorts of works as having a freshness to it and a spontaneity to them. Whereas if you have a piece of work where all of the detail has been worked up to a very, very fine polish all over, you can't take it in all at once. Your eye is not told where to look, and I'll come back to this in a moment. It's just, it has to scan the whole surface. Therefore, that is not our normal experience of seeing. If you've got a plant in your hand, a lovely big protea or something, if I took the protea and I spent 20 hours getting the surface perfectly right all over, you've got an image that people would admire the skill of and admire the ability to render that, but it's no longer how we actually see. The other thing about the three-dimensional is that you can pull the perspective very slightly. If you are trying to draw, let's stay with the protea as an example, then the bracts that are closest to you here will be in perspective very slightly bigger than the ones that are going away, that are further away from you. Make anything that is close to you fractionally bigger again, and things that are going away fractionally smaller. You slightly extend the natural sort of rules of linear perspective. You're going to make it look more three-dimensional. And let your edges dissolve. I think a lot of botanical drawing can go a bit flat when an artist works all the way to the edge. So just bear in mind that edges don't really exist. And also if it's on a white piece of paper, there can be a cutout effect. That's the problem that I have with my black and white drawings, is that I've got to render something tonally on bright white, which of course, almost creates a glare when you're looking at it, and therefore creates anything a silhouette. So I often dissolve the edges of my drawings. And if anyone looks at them, particularly in reproductions in Botany for the Artist, they'll see that I've used an eraser just to take off, to fade back areas of ink, to just get the surface to break a little bit. And also when I draw it, my edges are always broken, so that I describe part of a surface going around here, part of a surface at a different angle and different angle again, and those three lines relate to one another to suggest an outline, but actually they're describing three facets of something three-dimensional that doesn't have a real edge.
Well, I think we sort of transition happily into the next question, which is about how to create a focus in it.
The eye will move through a picture at the speed at which a mark is made. I think so. And therefore, if you were to have, we're not talking about botanical painting specifically now, but in terms of an expressive drawing, if you were to have a line that goes whoosh, straight through it, when you look at that line, you perceive its speed. You know what speed at which it was made. The same as if you're looking at a mark on a wall in a railway station, a bag has dragged along the wall. When you look at it, you know what made that mark. You see the trajectory of it and the speed of it. So going back to our whoosh, fast mark, then also if in your drawing you have other areas that are shorter marks, more staccato, then it means that if they're smaller and they're more concentrated and more slowly made in one particular area, your eye will stay in that area and read all those different marks. And if they're made very, very slowly and gently, you read slowness and gentleness from it. So in that simple example, you are conducting the viewer's eye at speed or slowly. There are enormous parallels between dance, music and drawing. And for me, a drawing is like an act of dance or like the performance of a piece of music. And if it were a piece of music, if it were a symphony that was played, you're going to have, I'm going to rapidly expose the fact I'm not a musician, right? But you might have the soloist, not necessarily in symphonies, but you have your soloist, you have one instrument that is carrying the line, carrying the tune that you're listening to. You might not be aware that they're being supported by other instruments here, and then they soften back, and another one comes to the fore, and then the whole refrain might be repeated, and there's something else going on underneath. So you've got different layers to music, different depths and different volumes to it. You need to have that in a drawing as well, and that's the equivalent of your eye having different sensory experiences as it moves around. So if you change the speed of your mark, the pressure, the direction, the size, the whole expression of it, then you can physically conduct the viewer's sensory experience and way of looking. You can direct where they look and where they don't, and what is important and what is not. So in terms of making a focus in your drawing, decide what are you drawing, why, for whom, what do you want to say with this particular image, and what is most important. And no one image can say everything. So choose what is most striking about this particular plant. What is its essential character, essential stance? What does it say to you immediately as a sort of like a personality? And get that across. But there'll be other structural elements and textual elements that you need to have present discreetly in order to define that species or get it right. But they mustn't shout too loudly. You've got to decide, who's your soloist? In all the qualities that this single plant possesses, if it has 5 or 6, you can distinctly say, in this image, which will you choose as your soloist? And let the others fade back. I mean, it may sound a bit crazy, but if I go to the tree, I study its stance, how it holds itself in space, what its personality is in effect, and then I choose a specimen that reflects that personality. And then when I'm drawing, I'm literally trying to say, what's the attitude of this plant? What's it doing? And then try to get it to actually perform its attitude in the drawing, which is not the same thing as measuring the widths of leaves and flowers and bits and pieces and adding them all up together and hoping it's the same thing. It's not.
It's just, I want to come back to one question that I know will be of help to our Biennale artists. And that is, in a situation where for an exhibition they are required to submit a certain number of works.
Yes.
One of the questions is how to provide a kind of uniformity and a cohesiveness to their work.
Okay.
Could you give us any of your insights on that?
Speaking as an outsider who has not taken part in any of these exhibitions, and therefore who's not familiar with particular rules that might come into play, then if I were an artist contributing to a show and I wanted 5 works to sit together, then from the outside working in, the framing would be the same. So there was a uniformity to the framing and the mounting, and it would be something that was so subtle that you weren't really aware of it. So I go for a very subtle grey of grey wood and a mount that's very sympathetic to the paper, so that you're doing your best to display the work without anybody really noticing that it's framed. So there needs to be a kind of an elegance to all the frames being the same. And then if I were going to choose a series of drawings, there would be a continuity in the subject, in that I might be just showing different aspects of that particular species or that plant, or it might be the plant in different seasons, or it might be, I once made a set of drawings which were of torrents of water, and it was a study, and each drawing gave you a different experience of the movement of the water, or studies of vortices which were within it. And so it means that each of your drawings is saying something different about whatever your chosen subject is, and actually working with the fact that no single drawing can say everything without being overcrowded. It's like a cacophony. It's sort of separating out your music into nice distinct pieces that all work harmoniously as one thing. Does that answer the question?
It does.
Okay. Illumination, the lighting as well. I know that botanical artists are trained to light their work, I think particularly from the left, which works very well if you're a Western artist and you've been taught to, from infancy we read and write. We read text from left to right. Therefore, something in our brain is trained to feel that that is the comfortable way of doing things. And it means that we will also have a tendency to think that light comes from the left as well. And therefore, if you illuminate your subjects from the left, then it will be comfortable. You're going with the tendency of your brain and probably that of the person looking at it. And then it means that when you're actually producing the work, I find it means I can let go of worrying about which direction the light is coming from, because all of my work is consistently illuminated from the top left. You find that in Western art. You wander around an art gallery, an awful lot of work is lit top left. Some artists consistently always so, for example Goya. But also it means then that if you're putting work into reproduction, that you're, as you look through the book, you haven't suddenly got a bizarre reversal of light coming from somewhere else, which you might not notice why a drawing has suddenly become rather uncomfortable and looks backwards, even though it's not backwards. It could be that the lighting is wrong. So whatever direction you choose, stay with it. So drawing, it's not that hard. I'm always inspired by thinking of Alfred Wallace, who was a British artist, an outsider artist, early 20th century, and he had been a fisherman, and then a Cornish fisherman, and then after retirement he became a rag and bone man. He was very poor, but when he was in his mid 80s, his wife died, and he was terribly heartbroken and lonely without her. So he took up painting, and as a rag and bone man he went around collecting bits of old yacht paint and boat paint and pieces of cardboard, and he taught himself to make the most lively, vibrant, sort of heart-moving, you know what I mean, paintings of the choppy seas and the wind coming into the harbour and all the boats, and it's a naive perspective, and they're beautiful, beautiful paintings which he started in his 80s. It's rather lovely if a great thing enters your life at a late stage. We don't get to experience everything that's wonderful when we're young, and then it's all over and what's left. So never too late.